You know, usually when we look at a really severe geopolitical crisis, there's this expectation of noise, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like a very visible escalation.
Exactly. We are totally conditioned to expect, I don't know, blaring sirens, breaking news banners just dominating the screen.
Right, the deafening roar of fighter jets taking off from aircraft carriers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because conflict usually feels chaotic. But in a strange way, that chaos is legible, you know? It's loud, it's visceral, and it tells you exactly what is happening in real time.
It's the traditional model of warfare, really. A kinetic action happens, and it's met with this immediate, overwhelming kinetic reaction.
Right. But when you look at the current situation in the Middle East, specifically, the incredibly tense waters of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, that expectation of noise is completely subverted.
Hmm.
We are looking at a geopolitical landscape defined not by the roar of jets, but by this incredibly heavy, calculated silence.
And that silence is exactly what we're unpacking today.
Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today, for you listening, is to basically act as your shortcut to understanding a highly complex, highly volatile puzzle.
Right, we're going to examine the strategic architecture of, well, one of the most critical global flashpoints of our time.
And to do that, we are looking at a really deeply revealing piece of source material. It's a comprehensive interview transcript featuring Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, hosted by Diesen.
Yeah, and for some context, Marandi is a professor at Tehran University, and he's a former advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team.
So he's very plugged in.
Very. And because we are diving into the strategic mindset of a key figure within the Iranian political sphere, it's vital to establish some ground rules for our discussion today.
Yeah, let's lay those out.
So this source material is a direct look into the worldview of the what they call the axis of resistance. It contains some highly charged political statements, very specific military claims, and harsh assessments of the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia.
Right. And just to be completely clear, our role today is not to endorse these viewpoints or validate the military claims or, take any political side whatsoever.
Exactly. To truly understand this global standoff, we have to understand how the actors on the other side of the board actually perceive the map, how they calculate risk, what logic drives their decision-making.
We are here to impartially deconstruct their strategy, basically mapping the architecture of their arguments so you can see the complete picture.
Right. We are dissecting the playbook, not joining the team.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start by looking at the immediate standoff that Marandi outlines in the source. Because Iran recently struck 2 ships affiliated with U.S. allies, reportedly for violating Iranian naval orders in the Gulf.
Right, which is a massive provocation.
Exactly. And if we look back at the prevailing rhetoric, specifically former President Trump's explicit threats of, obliterating Iran or bombing them back to the Stone Age if they took hostile action, the conventional expectation would be this massive, immediate American military retaliation.
But that didn't happen.
No. The U.S. did not launch a strike. A strange, tense quiet just fell over the region.
Well, Marandi interprets that lack of retaliation not as an absence of policy, but actually as a result of a highly successful deterrence strategy.
Okay, how so?
He argues that the United States recognizes the sheer density of the strategic environment. To comprehend why the U.S. military hesitated, Marandi suggests we have to temporarily look away from the Persian Gulf and actually focus on Yemen.
Wait, Yemen, not Iran directly.
Right. The actions of the Ansarullah forces, who are widely known in the West as the Houthis, they have fundamentally altered the risk calculus for the United States and its regional allies.
And the focal point of that altered calculus, according to the source, was the Yemeni strike on Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure.
Yeah, the massive Aramco facilities.
Right. And the source highlights a really specific detail about those strikes that kind of changes the entire complexion of the attack.
What's fascinating here is how they bypass some of the most advanced air defense systems in the world. They hit their targets with astonishing precision. But, and this is key, they deliberately chose not to destroy everything.
Wait, they held back?
Yes. They hit the processing capabilities, but they left Saudi Arabia's fundamental ability to export oil entirely intact.
Wow. Okay, so that distinction is, well, it's the cornerstone of coercive diplomacy, right?
Exactly. Marandi points out that hitting the export terminals and completely paralyzing the Saudi economy would have been an existential blow.
And when you inflict an existential blow, you leave your opponent with absolutely nothing to lose.
Right. The logic of the escalation ladder dictates that you must show your adversary that you possess the capability to devastate them while actively choosing to hold that devastation back.
It's basically a demonstration of dominance masked as restraint.
Yes, exactly.
It actually makes me think of like a pressure valve on a massive industrial boiler.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah. Right, because if you weld the valve completely shut, the pressure just builds until the entire facility explodes, taking you down with it.
Mhm.
But if you demonstrate that you control the valve, that you can tighten it until the machinery groans, but leave just enough release to prevent a total catastrophe, well, then you control the behavior of the people operating the machine.
That's spot on. Yemen and Iran are essentially showing Saudi Arabia and the U.S. that they have their hands firmly on the economic pressure valve of the global oil market.
Right. They're saying, we can shut this down entirely, but we are choosing not to. Now change your policy, lift the siege, and your economy survives.
Yeah. But, I mean, does this restraint actually work, or does it just look like hesitation to an overwhelming military power like the U.S.?
Well, according to Marandi, it works, but that effectiveness relies entirely on geographic leverage. We have to examine the map, specifically the Red Sea.
Right, because when tensions peak in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz becomes perilous for Allied shipping, which Marandi claims Iran has the capacity to enforce, Saudi Arabia has a backup plan.
The East-West pipeline.
Exactly. They rely on that pipeline to pump oil across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea coast. That western coastline becomes their absolute lifeline for export.
Which means the entire Saudi economic survival strategy suddenly hinges on a body of water that is essentially controlled by Yemen.
Precisely. Yemen sits geographically dominant over the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the lower Red Sea.
Wow. So Ansarallah isn't merely demonstrating technical proficiency with drones and missiles.
No, they are demonstrating undeniable geographic dominance over Saudi Arabia's emergency exit.
So when the Gulf allies look at that restraint, they don't see hesitation. They see an adversary that has methodically calculated its geographic and military leverage and is basically daring them to escalate.
Exactly. But if Yemen holds that kind of leverage over the global energy market, we really have to look at the forces driving their willingness to use it.
Right, because the population doesn't just wake up one day and decide to challenge the combined military and economic might of the United States and Saudi Arabia without a profound catalyst.
No, of course not. And the source material traces this current standoff back to a deeply brutal historical context, starting with a surprisingly specific, almost mundane event.
A funeral, right.
Yeah, a funeral. Geopolitical explosions often have these highly symbolic detonators. Marandi details an incident where Iran decided to overtly challenge the years-long blockade on Yemen.
And they didn't do this by, sending a military convoy.
No, they sent a civilian passenger plane carrying a delegation to attend the funeral of a prominent Yemeni figure.
Wow, just a standard civilian plane.
Yeah. It was a calculated political statement, a physical manifestation of Iran's refusal to recognize the legitimacy of the siege.
The source actually notes that the Saudi Air Force initially attempted to intercept the passenger plane, but was warned off by anti-aircraft defenses, allowing the delegation to land, attend the funeral, and depart.
But the catalyst occurred immediately after. According to Marandi, the Saudis bombed the airport runway the moment the plane left Iranian airspace.
Which is a violent reassertion of the blockade, ensuring the runway could not be used again to break the quarantine.
Right, and Marandi categorizes that specific bombing as a catastrophic miscalculation.
Because it wasn't seen as just standard military action.
Exactly. It was viewed as an act of war against a diplomatic mission, which is what triggered the massive immediate retaliation against the Saudi oil infrastructure we just discussed.
But to understand why bombing an airport runway provoked a strike on the global energy supply, we really have to look at the decade of history that preceded it.
Yeah, Marandi outlines a prolonged war that has fundamentally reshaped the psychology of the region.
He does not mince words when describing the conditions imposed on Yemen since the war escalated around 2015.
No, he doesn't. He describes the situation as genocidal, detailing a comprehensive hermetic siege designed to weaponize starvation and deprivation against the civilian population.
And he heavily emphasizes that this was not a localized conflict, but a campaign entirely reliant on Western logistical and intelligence support.
The mechanics of that siege are really crucial to understanding Yemen's current posture. It wasn't just a military blockade, it was a total economic and humanitarian strangulation.
Right.
Marandi highlights the human cost to explain this shift from vulnerability to hyper-resilience. When a society is subjected to a blockade so severe that basic caloric intake and medical supplies are weaponized, that societal trauma, eventually calcifies into an unbreakable ideological resolve.
There's actually a really visceral anecdote in the transcript that illustrates the reality of this blockade. Marandi recounts a claim regarding a senior U.S. official who allegedly admitted to intercepting a vessel attempting to run the blockade.
And it wasn't carrying weapons, was it?
No, the boat wasn't smuggling weapons or munitions, it was smuggling basic medicine into Yemen. According to this account, the coalition forces confiscated the medicine and simply dumped it into the ocean.
That is just staggering.
Yeah. And the source juxtaposes this with the claim that thousands of British and American military advisors were essential to keeping the Saudi Air Force operational.
Right, providing the maintenance and targeting intelligence necessary to bomb infrastructure, schools, and even funerals.
Exactly. So for you listening, when we evaluate Morandi's argument, that historical context is the skeleton key. It explains why traditional deterrence fails against the Yemeni forces today.
Because Western military doctrine often relies on the threat of economic sanctions or the destruction of infrastructure to coerce an adversary. But, how do you deter a population that has already survived a decade of enforced starvation and relentless aerial bombardment?
You really can't. The threat of inflicting pain loses its utility when the adversary's threshold for pain has been pushed beyond standard human limits.
For Yemen, this is framed not as a border dispute or a proxy skirmish, but as a fundamental war for biological and societal survival.
Which brings us to a fascinating tactical pivot.
Yeah.
If you have a highly motivated force with a massive tolerance for pain, the critical question becomes how they manage to arm themselves, right?
Right, and how do they execute these complex strikes while under constant surveillance?
Here's where it gets really interesting. The source material reveals an astonishing approach to operational security, highlighting a massive blind spot in Western intelligence gathering.
Yeah, Marandi offers a surprisingly candid assessment of his own country's political culture to explain this. He notes that Iranians are culturally very talkative, highly engaged in politics, and prone to endless debate.
He actually references a joke, right, that Iran has 90 million leaders.
Yes, where everyone from the taxi driver to the senior political advisor believes they know exactly what the state is planning.
And he realized that this cultural trait was actually functioning as a massive organic smokescreen.
Oh, totally.
Mm-hmm.
He was speaking with high-ranking political advisors in Tehran, people who hold significant titles and ostensibly have top-level clearance, and he discovered that the information they confidently believed about Iran's military strategy was entirely inaccurate.
Wow. So the implications of that compartmentalization are profound. The Iranian military establishment, specifically the Revolutionary Guard Corps, had effectively walled off its operational realities from its own political class.
Right. They recognize that Western intelligence agencies rely heavily on human intelligence. They monitor communications, they recruit assets, and they listen to the chatter of the political elite.
So by keeping the politicians in the dark, the military turned their own government officials into unwitting decoys.
Exactly. If an intelligence agency intercepts a conversation between two senior Iranian diplomats discussing a supposed military limitation, the intelligence is deemed highly credible because the diplomats genuinely believe what they are saying.
They pass the polygraph.
Right. But the reality is that the military is operating on a completely detached subterranean track. It is a brilliant form of passive counterintelligence.
It forces the U.S. and its allies to build their threat assessments on perfectly authentic misinformation.
And while the political class was debating imaginary constraints, the military was building an industrial-scale, asymmetric war machine.
The source material details an extensive network of underground facilities, and we aren't talking about small, improvised weapons caches hidden in caves.
No, Marandi describes massive, subterranean factories churning out endless strings of drones and ballistic missiles, completely shielded from satellite surveillance and conventional bunker-busting munitions.
He even mentions that Iran deliberately maintains visible above-ground factories as well, essentially offering them up as bait for surveillance satellites, while the actual production capacity is buried deep within the mountains.
And the economic philosophy behind this arsenal is just as important as the engineering. Marandi notes that the axis of resistance heavily prioritizes the deployment of older, cheaper drones.
Right, they aren't initiating conflicts with their most advanced, expensive hypersonic technology.
No, they're leveraging the mathematics of attrition. It is a deliberate strategy to invert the cost-exchange ratio.
So when a force like Yemen or Iran launches a swarm of drones that costs, perhaps $20 or $30,000 each to manufacture, they force the United States and its allies to respond with advanced air defense interceptors like Patriot missiles.
Which can cost upwards of $3 to $4 million per shot.
It's crazy. You are forcing a superpower to bankrupt its own defense budget just to maintain the status quo in the airspace.
You exhaust their magazines with cheap, mass-produced hardware, and only when their defensive batteries are depleted do you deploy the advanced precision munitions.
But, I have to question the long-term viability of relying on cheap drones against the most well-funded military research and development apparatus on the planet.
Sure.
Doesn't this strategy assume the U.S. military will remain static?
Yeah.
We're talking about a military that is actively developing directed energy weapons, AI-driven targeting algorithms, and advanced electronic warfare jamming. Won't technology eventually neutralize the cheap drone swarm?
Well, that is the central debate in modern military technology. However, Marandi's calculus is based on the friction of time. Developing, testing, procuring, and deploying next-generation directed energy weapons or AI radar takes years, often decades, of bureaucratic and engineering effort.
Right.
But running out of current-generation interceptor missiles during a high-intensity swarm attack can happen in a matter of weeks.
Oh, I see.
The vulnerability isn't necessarily the technology itself, but the magazine depth, the sheer physical quantity of defensive munitions available on hand. The underground factories can produce cheap offensive weapons faster than the U.S. supply chain can replenish expensive defensive ones.
So it is a war of logistical endurance rather than pure technological superiority.
Exactly. And the psychological warfare component accompanying this arsenal is incredibly aggressive.
Yeah, Marandi points out that right before the U.S. halted a planned bombing campaign, Iran didn't just issue a vague threat.
No, they claim to possess granular, hyper-specific intelligence on American troop deployments across the region.
They allegedly identified the exact hotels, the specific floors, and the individual buildings housing American forces in the Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar, and explicitly threatened to level those specific locations.
That level of tactical specificity is designed to shatter the illusion of a safe rear echelon.
It tells the adversary that their operational security is compromised and that retaliation will be precise, unavoidable, and deeply personal.
It forces the political leadership in Washington to weigh the domestic fallout of massive, sudden casualties against the geopolitical goal of the strike.
Which perfectly transitions us from the military battlefield to the macroeconomic battlefield. Because enduring a prolonged conflict requires more than just underground factories. It requires an economy capable of surviving extreme isolation.
Right. And the source material presents a stark contrast in economic endurance between the U.S. allied Gulf states and the Iranian bloc.
Marandi identifies the economic structure of Saudi Arabia as a critical strategic vulnerability. Despite possessing immense sovereign wealth, Saudi Arabia functions essentially as a rentier state. Its entire economic ecosystem, its domestic stability, and its global influence are almost entirely dependent on a single commodity.
The uninterrupted export of oil.
Exactly. If the regional waterways, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, are contested or shut down for even a few months, the Saudi state faces catastrophic internal pressure.
They lose their primary revenue stream overnight.
And while they have hundreds of billions in foreign reserves sitting in Western banks, the source implies a deep skepticism about whether the U.S. financial system would actually allow them to liquidate those assets rapidly enough to stave off a domestic collapse during a regional war.
Conversely, Marandi argues that decades of crushing Western sanctions have inadvertently immunized the Iranian economy against sudden shocks.
That's fascinating. So the sanctions backfired.
In a way, yes. The intention of the sanctions was to isolate and break the Iranian state, but the result, according to the source, was the forced development of a diversified, quote-unquote, resistance economy.
Because they could not rely on selling oil to buy foreign goods, they had to develop their own domestic agriculture, build their own pharmaceutical industries, and create internal supply chains.
The sanctions acted like a stress test that forced the economy to evolve. And Marandi highlights a highly tactical economic maneuver Iran executed to prepare for the current standoff.
Oh, right, the brief diplomatic window.
Yeah. There was a period where a memorandum of understanding was in place, temporarily easing some restrictions.
And Iran anticipated that the United States would eventually violate or withdraw from this agreement.
Exactly. So instead of trusting the diplomatic process, they used that brief window of relaxed enforcement to execute a massive preemptive economics sprint.
They deployed their shadow fleet.
They rapidly loaded tens of tankers with oil and bypassed traditional financial systems to sell it directly to Asian markets.
Just a massive off-book transfer.
Yes, which generated an immediate influx of capital. And simultaneously, they rushed critical supply ships full of necessary materials back into Iranian ports.
They aggressively built a financial and material buffer.
Right. So by the time the diplomatic agreements collapsed and the economic siege was reinstated, Iran was already provisioned for a prolonged freeze.
While the U.S. and its allies were suddenly scrambling to manage a spiked energy market. And the vulnerability of that global energy market is a major theme in the source. Marandi references a claim attributed to Donald Trump during his presidency that in a major crisis scenario, the United States only possessed about 4 weeks of energy reserves.
Which is a terrifying thought for Western planners.
Yeah, whether that specific timeline is hyper-accurate or just political rhetoric, it underscores a fundamental asymmetry. The complex, highly optimized economies of the West require a continuous, uninterrupted flow of cheap energy to prevent systemic collapse.
While the axis of resistance operates on a fundamentally different threshold. Which brings us to Morandi's core sociological theory, the asymmetry of pain tolerance.
The idea that the outcome of a prolonged standoff isn't determined by who can inflict the most damage.
No, it's determined by who can absorb the most damage without politically collapsing. Marandi argues that the populations of Iran and Yemen can endure vastly more economic hardship, rationing, and physical destruction than the populations of the West.
Because the ideological framing of the conflict is entirely different.
Precisely. For Yemen and Iran, the narrative is one of existential defense. When a population genuinely believes they are fighting to prevent the erasure of their nation or their religion, they will accept almost any level of domestic suffering.
They'll endure hyperinflation, they'll endure power grid failures.
But for the United States, Marandi argues this is perceived as a war of choice.
Right. The average American citizen does not view a conflict in the Persian Gulf as a defense of the American homeland.
It is seen as an expeditionary conflict to maintain regional hegemony or to secure the interests of allies like Israel.
Consequently, the American public's tolerance for the blowback of that war, whether it manifests as soaring gas prices, supply chain collapses, or, body bags returning home, is incredibly low.
The political cost of sustained economic pain in a war of choice is usually fatal to an American administration.
So if the U.S. is facing a heavily armed opponent with a massive pain tolerance, an economy built for isolation, and the ability to trigger a global energy crisis, what actual military options remain on the table?
Well, Marandi argues that the U.S. is trapped in a strategic gridlock, facing a scenario where every kinetic option leads to disaster.
Let's break down the two primary military avenues the source discusses. First, the traditional U.S. approach. Heavy, sustained airstrikes.
The doctrine of shock and awe. The issue with this approach, according to Marandi's analysis of Iranian deterrence, is that Iran will not limit its retaliation to American assets.
Right. If the U.S. launches a massive aerial bombardment against Iranian soil, Iran's declared doctrine is to immediately and overwhelmingly strike the critical infrastructure of the Arab states hosting U.S. bases or facilitating the coalition.
And the source points out a brilliant, terrifyingly fragile structural vulnerability in those Gulf states.
The desalination plants.
It is the ultimate geographic Achilles heel. The wealthy nations of the Arabian Peninsula, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, they're essentially highly developed cities built in a desert.
They lack adequate natural fresh water.
To survive, they rely on massive, intricate coastal desalination facilities to convert seawater into drinking water. These plants account for nearly 99% of their municipal water supply.
Wait, 99%?
Yes. While Iran, by contrast, relies on desalination for perhaps 1% of its water, utilizing natural rivers and aquifers for the rest.
And these desalination plants are not hardened military bunkers.
No. They are sprawling industrial facilities utilizing delicate reverse osmosis membranes and requiring massive, uninterrupted power grids to function.
So if Iranian precision-guided munitions destroy those coastal facilities, it creates an immediate apocalyptic scenario for those countries.
Modern society can endure disruption in oil revenue for months. A city in the desert cannot survive without drinking water for more than a few days.
The cities would become uninhabitable, forcing mass evacuations and total state collapse.
The deterrence relies on mutual assured destruction, not of nuclear arsenals, but of foundational infrastructure.
The threat of rendering their allies' societies literally unlivable effectively neutralizes the viability of a U.S. air campaign.
Which forces military planners to consider the other extreme, a ground invasion to physically secure the waterways.
Yeah, the source material specifically mentions a theory floated by some U.S. counterterrorism figures, the idea of launching a marine invasion to occupy strategic Iranian islands, like Karg Island, in order to force the Strait of Hormuz open by sheer physical presence.
Marandi dismisses this strategy as a dangerous anachronism. He points out that the U.S. military is conceptualizing the geography of the 21st century using 19th century naval doctrine.
Right. Historically, to control a maritime choke point, you needed to physically occupy the shoreline and place warships directly in the strait.
But the advent of mobile, precision-guided anti-ship missiles has completely decoupled geographic control from physical occupation.
Exactly. Marandi explains that Iran doesn't need to deploy exposed infantry on the beaches of the Persian Gulf to control the shipping lanes.
The Iranian coastline is dominated by the Zagros Mountains. Iran has built a vast network of mobile anti-ship cruise missiles deep within the complex, cluttered terrain of those mountains.
So they can track and sink vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, or even deep into the northern Persian Gulf, from fortified positions hundreds of miles inland.
Right, so a U.S. invasion force could successfully storm the beaches, take heavy casualties, and eventually raise a flag over Karg Island, but the victory would be entirely hollow.
Because the strait would remain a kill zone, the missiles enforcing the blockade are firing from mountain valleys deep in the interior.
It's like trying to secure a deadly, narrow hallway by standing completely exposed right in the middle of it.
Meanwhile, your adversary is safely locked behind heavy doors on either side, firing blindly through the walls.
You might technically occupy the space, but you are nothing more than a stationary target.
And that analogy doesn't even factor in the environmental brutality of the region. Marandi emphasizes the logistical nightmare of sustaining an occupation force in the Middle East during the summer.
Where temperatures routinely exceed 50 degrees Celsius, which is around 122 degrees Fahrenheit.
Just the logistics of keeping soldiers hydrated in that environment are staggering.
Exactly. If the regional ports and infrastructure have been destroyed in the opening salvos, supplying millions of gallons of drinking water, medical supplies, and ammunition to an expeditionary force fighting entrenched troops on their home soil, it becomes a practically impossible mathematical equation.
So Morandi's conclusion is that the United States has basically engineered its own paralysis.
Yes, an air campaign triggers the destruction of their regional allies, and a ground invasion leads to an unwinnable, logistically impossible quagmire against an adversary operating from impenetrable mountain fortresses.
The conventional military toolset has been neutralized by a combination of asymmetric technology and harsh geography.
And if the military options are neutralized, the only path forward is diplomatic negotiation.
But Marandi paints a very bleak picture of diplomacy, arguing that the foundation of trust required for negotiation has been systematically dismantled by the United States.
Right. We have to look at the broader geopolitical fallout of the broken agreements. Marandi points to the fate of the previous Memorandum of Understanding, which heavily implies the framework surrounding the JCPOA or subsequent back-channel agreements.
He sees its failure as the primary reason diplomacy is currently frozen.
Because he outlines a series of perceived betrayals by the United States. He alleges that the U.S. failed to restrain Israeli military actions in Lebanon as agreed, that they refused to unfreeze and return legally sovereign Iranian financial assets, and that they illegally established a rogue corridor for their own shipping in the Strait of Hormuz.
Which directly violated the terms of the de-escalation framework.
Exactly. So because of that track record, Marandi asserts that the era of Iran accepting paper promises is over. They will not return to the status quo of pausing their programs in exchange for future relief.
If the U.S. wants to negotiate, Iran will demand massive structural upfront concessions before any dialogue begins.
The price of admission to the negotiating table has skyrocketed.
But the failure of U.S. diplomatic and military policy isn't just an isolated regional issue.
No, it's not. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Marandi introduces a macro-level geopolitical theory regarding the unintentional consequences of American grand strategy.
The United States is currently attempting to maintain its unipolar global hegemony by simultaneously applying maximum pressure to Iran, Russia, and China.
By treating the entire Eurasian landmass as a hostile entity, the U.S. is inadvertently forging a grand unification of its adversaries.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but played out on a continental scale with nuclear-armed states.
And the source provides a tangible example of this integration. Marandi mentions Ukrainian President Zelensky's claims regarding Iranian drones and weaponry moving across the Caspian Sea to supply the Russian military.
Right. Regardless of whether one views this as a legitimate defense partnership or illicit arms smuggling, the geopolitical reality is that heavy U.S. sanctions have forced Tehran and Moscow to integrate their logistical, economic, and military networks.
They were sharing intelligence, they're bypassing Western financial systems, and coordinating strategy because the U.S. has left them with no other rational option but deep cooperation.
And this pragmatic alignment produces some truly unexpected alliances. One of the most surprising segments of the source material is Morandi's discussion of the relationship between Iran and the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Oh, yeah. From a historical and ideological perspective, this seems impossible.
Right. Because Iran is a Shia Islamic republic. The Taliban is a Sunni fundamentalist group that has historically engaged in extreme violence against Shia populations. Why would they ever cooperate?
Marandi explains this through the lens of pure, ruthless, anti-imperialist pragmatism. He compares Iran's current engagement with the Taliban to its intervention in Syria.
How so?
Well, Western analysts frequently attempt to view Middle Eastern conflicts through purely sectarian lens, right? Sunni versus Shia, framing them as ancient religious hatreds. But Marandi argues that Iran's grand strategy supersedes sectarianism. The overarching objective is to expel the empire, the United States military presence, from the region.
So if achieving that goal requires supporting a secular government in Syria, they will do it.
Exactly. And if it requires supporting a fundamentalist Sunni insurgency to end the American occupation of Afghanistan, they will do it. It is a prioritization of geopolitical security over ideological purity.
And Marandi argues that this pragmatic gamble in Afghanistan is actually paying massive dividends for Iranian national security.
Yes. While the new generation of Taliban leadership remains deeply ideologically opposed to Iran on issues like human rights and female education, they share a mutual existential enemy,
ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliates.
which the source refers to as Takfiri groups.
And Marandi makes the explosive claim that these Takfiri groups have often been tacitly utilized or supported by U.S. and Israeli intelligence apparatuses as tools to destabilize the region and fracture anti-Western governments.
Whether or not one accepts that claim of direct intelligence backing, the reality on the ground is that the Taliban is currently engaged in a brutal, highly effective counterinsurgency campaign against ISIS-Khorasan in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
So by maintaining a working diplomatic and security relationship with the Taliban, Iran has essentially outsourced the security of its incredibly long, porous eastern border.
Exactly. The Taliban is fighting Iran's most vicious sectarian enemies, allowing the Iranian military to focus entirely on the West and the Persian Gulf.
It is a complex, evolving, multipolar reality that completely breaks the old unipolar models of how alliances are supposed to work.
It forces us to completely discard the old geopolitical playbook.
And this brings us to the final major theme of the source material, which connects these massive global realignments directly back to the public watching these events unfold.
We have discussed the military hardware, the economic endurance, and the geographic leverage. But Marandi concludes by analyzing the information war.
Specifically focusing on how the Western monopoly on the global narrative is disintegrating.
For the last several decades, the West, primarily the United States and Europe, didn't merely control the global financial system. They controlled the lens through which the world understood itself.
Marandi offers a really striking historical anecdote to illustrate this. He notes that in the past, if a university student in Iran, or anywhere in the global south really, wanted to understand the politics of China, they couldn't easily access an indigenous Chinese perspective.
Nor did they have their own domestic scholarship on the topic.
Exactly. They were forced to read books by American strategists like Henry Kissinger, translated into Persian or Arabic.
The translation wasn't just linguistic, it was structural. The entire developing world was forced to view global events through an American ideological filter.
The West defined who the rational actors were, who the rogue states were, and what constituted a legitimate use of force.
But Marandi argues that this era of narrative dominance is permanently over. The proliferation of the internets, the rise of alternative media networks, and the development of independent journalism within the global south have shattered the mainstream media's gatekeeping ability.
Nations are developing direct networks of information exchange. They no longer require Western media conglomerates to contextualize global events for them.
But the most profound observation Marandi makes isn't about how the global south views the West. It is about how the citizens of the West are beginning to view themselves.
Yes. The breakdown of narrative control is happening internally. As alternative media platforms bypass the traditional editorial filters, Western citizens are gaining direct, unfiltered access to the realities of these conflicts.
They are seeing the devastation in Gaza, the realities of the blockade in Yemen, and the deep economic blowback of their government's sanction policies.
Marandi argues that this exposure is triggering a profound psychological shift.
The Western public is increasingly waking up to the realization that their political elites are not acting as the noble defenders of Western civilization or democratic values.
Instead, they are increasingly viewing their leadership as a detached, self-serving, and corrupt ruling class.
A class that consistently makes foreign policy decisions, like funding endless proxy wars or imposing sanctions that trigger domestic inflation that actively harm the economic interests and the moral standing of ordinary citizens.
It represents the ultimate form of blowback.
The unipolar hegemony isn't just failing to project power abroad, it is rapidly losing its moral and political legitimacy at home.
The shift toward a multipolar world isn't just about the realignment of nations and trade routes. It is about a fundamental realignment of public consciousness.
Exactly.
Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by examining a strangely quiet night in the Persian Gulf, and we followed the strategic logic of that silence through the underground drone factories of the Zagros Mountains, across the vulnerable coastal desalination plants of the Arabian Peninsula, and into a fundamental restructuring of global alliances and the media landscape.
As we conclude, I just want to briefly reiterate the framework of our discussion. This deep dive was an exercise in mapping the strategic architecture of the axis of resistance, exactly as it was articulated by Professor Marandi in the source material. Understanding their perception of the geopolitical board, their tolerance for economic pain, and their asymmetric military doctrine is absolutely essential for anticipating how this conflict will evolve. Grasping this perspective is a prerequisite for being truly informed, regardless of one's personal political stance on the underlying issues.
You cannot predict the outcome of the match if you refuse to look at the opponent's strategy.
Very well said.
And that brings us to the end of our dive. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a lingering question to consider. A thought experiment that builds on everything we have unpacked today, but looks slightly over the horizon. We have spent this entire deep dive examining how the control of oil and the geographic choke points of the Middle East dictate the balance of global power.
Right. The leverage of the axis of resistance heavily relies on their ability to disrupt the flow of fossil fuels.
But what happens to this entire geopolitical chessboard 30 years from now if the global economy successfully transitions to renewable energy? Does the axis of resistance lose its ultimate strategic trump card when the world no longer relies on the Strait of Hormuz to keep the lights on? Or will new choke points, perhaps controlling the critical minerals needed for batteries and solar panels, simply replace the old ones, shifting the geography of conflict without changing the nature of it? Keep digging, keep questioning the narratives, and stay curious. We will catch you on the next deep dive.